The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is the basis that underlies our multilateral work on climate change. It has near universal membership and has as its ultimate objective the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Moving on to the science, I think we've heard a lot this morning from the opening statements about the IPCC, and we have both parents of the IPCC here, which are UNEP and WMO. Basically, the main messages out of the latest assessment, this is the 4th assessment report of the IPCC, is that global warming is unequivocal. And the trend here is that we have, over the past decade or two, increased our certainty on the nature of the climate change phenomenon and increased our certainty in regard to the link between human activity and the phenomenon itself. An expected rise in temperature will be between 1.8 to 4 degrees by the end of the century. It will lead to diminished food security, melting of glaciers and ice caps, leading to a rise in sea levels, a lot of vulnerability in coastal zones, stresses on water resources, health impacts, extreme events will increase in intensity and frequency. We're seeing the impacts of climate change affect much more sectors than the environment sector. They're into water resources, they're into health, they're into agriculture, they're into tourism. And I think the new realization is that climate change is not an environmental issue anymore. It's more of a development issue. And in fact, for some, it's a survival issue. So, as I said in my introduction, the two areas of action on addressing climate change are mitigation and adaptation. And tomorrow we're dealing, I think, with adaptation. The whole day, the day after tomorrow, we'll have a panel on mitigation. Mitigation is basically trying to solve the problem, reduce the harmful substances that go into the air and cause a rise in temperature. So basically reduce the sources of GHGs or enhance their sinks, plant more trees so they'll absorb carbon dioxide, basically. The second area of work is adaptation, which means how to cope with the adverse effects of climate change. Now, what we know now is that even if we stop emitting greenhouse gases altogether, there will still be residual impacts that will be felt because we're locked into a certain degree of climate change. So adaptation is inevitable. It will happen. We're focusing our discourse on adaptation now mainly on reducing the negative effects of climate change. But there's also another side of it. In some areas there might be positive effects that countries can capitalize on. But this is not high on the agenda at this stage given the urgency of the other side. There are challenges in engaging industries in the climate change context. And the challenges emerge from these few bullets that I'm mentioning here. How do we pay for things in the climate change context? The convention has created a number of funds. One of them, which does not only service climate change but other focal areas as well, is the Global Environment Facilities Trust Fund. And that funds projects that contain a global incremental benefit, something that can help the global environment. So many mitigation projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions are eligible for funding there, and a lot of energy efficiency projects and renewables have been funded from the GEF Trust Fund so far. The second one is the Least Developed Countries Fund, which we have to help the LDCs implement the projects coming out of their national adaptation programs of action. The third, more recent one, is the Special Climate Change Fund, which supports both mitigation and adaptation projects. A new fund, which is very special, is coming into being next year the Adaptation Fund. And the difference between this one and the others is that it's not based on voluntary contributions, but on a share of proceeds on clean development mechanism projects. So it's getting carbon finance automatically from the market, and it's expected to have probably around $425 million through 2012. But this is dependent on how much projects will be done through the clean development mechanism. So we have this other trend now, which is there's a gradual move towards carbon finance to complement voluntary contributions. We realize that voluntary contributions for climate change will not be sufficient given the estimates, for example, presented by the Stern Review earlier this year or by the World Bank as well. The order of magnitude is totally different from what's available now. So we need some market-based system to bring in finance, and this is an early example of it, the Adaptation Fund.